Yeah, so already they've departed so significantly from the faith that they had inherited that Yahweh already comes on the scene and says, you're going to be uprooted. Exile will happen.
Reaching from way down here. From way down here.
Welcome to Thread, a podcast designed to explore God's story and lead you into a full life in Christ.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation, co-hosted by myself, Hannah D'Souza, and Dr. David Proctor. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Thread. We have just finished a series. It was God's People Blessed, and we are beginning a new series this week, and it's titled God's People Divided. And we're beginning here with episode 36 on Israel's kings. And we've got a few guests actually coming up in this series to look forward to. I won't give any spoilers, but we have one with us too that Dave will introduce.
One today with us who, yes, we will get a chance to hear from Dr. Dudley here in just a minute. But before we do, we have to do our wellness check on Gilgamesh. We told our listeners last week. How's Gilgamesh doing?
I brought him up front because Dave made me.
I did.
Can you see? The background's a bit blurred.
Yeah, he's green.
Hanging in there. A few leaves have dropped.
But yeah, all right.
Still alive.
Good.
A year later. It's been a year. So.
It's been a year. Very proud of you there, Hannah. Good job.
Thank you.
So today's going to be a really interesting conversation. I am excited to have Dr. Dudley Chancey here with us, but this podcast is one of the most haunting discussions regarding the impact of our spirituality on future generations. And that's one of the reasons we have Dr. Chancey here with us. This is his area of work and expertise. So I'm going to ask him to introduce himself. He's an old friend. Well, not that he's old, but he's been a friend for a long time. So Dr. Chancey.
Well, thanks for letting me join you and Hannah today. I'm retired, taught at university for 25 years, just retired a year or so ago, but I am the director of the Intergenerational Faith Center and doing full-time research. We just finished a research project on grandparents transmitting faith, and that's a book coming out at ACU Press. We've got another project going about youth ministry profiles, longevity and ministry, working on that. I just got back from doing a paper and back from Honduras. Also, we do a lot of mission work in Honduras. We do youth conferences around the country. We have a youth ministers conference we do every January. And I've known Dave for
20. We met in 2003, fall of 2003. Wow. It's been almost 21 years.
So that's been a formative relationship. For me. Yeah.
I feel that way too. In fact, Dudley was on my dissertation committee.
Oh, wow.
So it was a blessing.
That was a lot of fun. So,
well, I'm excited to hear what you got to say about the great kings of Israel and not so great kings.
Not so great. Well, I can give some background from where we left off. Last week was at the end of Solomon's life, and his heart had turned away from God. So he began well, but then he drifted. And at the end, we see Yahweh's anger towards Solomon, having disobeyed and allowed his many wives to lead him astray to follow other gods. And then we see the prophecy that came that the kingdom would be torn away from Solomon and given to one of his servants. But there's the caveat that for the sake of David, one tribe would remain in the family and go to David's grandson, Rehoboam. So that's where we ended last week.
Yeah, and then the bigger picture, we've been tracing this meta-narrative and bringing this key aspect of the story that was told to Israel way back when they were in the wilderness. And so I want to make sure we remember that, because what we're about to see is that unfold. So all the way back in Deuteronomy, right before they crossed into the promised land, Yahweh had Moses review this life or death teaching before crossing the Jordan River. He reminds them, if they obey, they'll be blessed. If they disobey, that they will be cursed. And there's 3 key verses in Deuteronomy 28, Hannah, that we'll put up on the screen, but if you could read them for us, I think it's a really great summary that kind of gives us some context to this story.
Yeah. So Deuteronomy 28 verse 1 says, "If you will only obey Yahweh your God by diligently observing all his commandments that I am commanding you today, Yahweh your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth." And in verse 15, it says, "But if you will not obey Yahweh your God by diligently observing all his commandments and decrees I am commanding you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you." Then in verse 63, "And just as Yahweh took delight in making you prosperous and numerous, so Yahweh will take delight in bringing you to ruin and destruction." That's intense.
Yeah.
"You shall be plucked off the land that you are entering to possess. Yahweh will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your ancestors have known."
Yeah, it is very intense. And they've been in the promised land for quite a while. So we saw Joshua bring them over. We saw all the period of the judges. We've seen the 120 years of a united kingdom through the 3 kings that we've just looked at with Saul, David, and Solomon. But in summary, what is being said here, in really simple summary, is Yahweh is saying, if you walk with me and do good here, you're going to be blessed. If you don't walk with me, you will be cursed. And if you behave really poorly, you'll be exiled. And exile, just for those of us who may not know, exile is literally being removed, physically being removed from the land that they were given and promised. So they would lose this promised land and now find themselves living amongst other nations. So today we begin to see all this play out. This is a difficult period for Israel. And we're going to look at this through the journey. So if we go back and we look at the big picture here of what we've covered in this series or in thread for this first season, we've seen all this, and we now enter into this what's called the divided kingdom. Right after Solomon dies, we enter a period where now Israel no longer is one nation. It's going to become 2 nations. And we'll start seeing that even by the time we get to the New Testament, how we're going to recognize some of the things that start playing out here. So, as you just said, Solomon died around 931. We've talked about the judgment on Solomon. Today, we pick up with Solomon's servant, Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam is in charge of the forced labor in the house of Joseph. So remember when Yahweh said to Solomon, one of your servants will be king, this is a man who worked for Solomon. And Yahweh sends a prophet named Ahijah, and he meets Jeroboam on the road just outside of Jerusalem. He's wearing this fancy new garment, and when he gets to Jeroboam on the road, he takes off his garment, he tears it into 12 pieces, and then he has a very important message that Yahweh wants to pass on to Jeroboam. So Hannah, if you could, let's read 1 Kings 11:31.
"He then said to Jeroboam, 'Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel. See, I'm about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. 1 tribe will remain his for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. This is because he has forsaken me, worshipped Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the Ammonites, and has not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight and keeping my statutes and my ordinances as his father David did. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom away from him, but will make him ruler all the days of his life, for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose, and who did keep my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom away from his son and give it to you, that is, the 10 tribes. Yet to his son I will give 1 tribe, so that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I've chosen to put my name.'"
Yeah, and of course, this is exactly what happens. Jeroboam consolidates these 10 tribes in the north, where he will become the king. And Judah will now be the southern kingdom and will be led by Solomon's son Rehoboam. So you may do, if you do math, you go, wait, that's 10 tribes in the north, 1 tribe in the south. What happened to the 12th tribe? Judah gets folded into Judah, or sorry, Benjamin gets folded into Judah. And so that's why it's said to have 1 tribe in the south. So Jeroboam in the north, this is kind of what sets everything off now. Jeroboam's concerned. So he's got these 10 tribes, but the capital city, the holy city, and where the temple resides is in the south in Judah, in Jerusalem. So what his concern is when people go to worship, they have to travel to Jerusalem, and they're going to sacrifice and worship, and then they're going to decide how much they like to be connected to Judah, and they'll return to Rehoboam as their king. And so because he doesn't want to lose people's loyalty to him, he makes 2 golden calves. He places one in Bethel and he puts the other in Dan. And these now become the gods of the northern tribes. So it's interesting, we talk, Hannah and I talk a lot about Walter Brueggemann. He's a fan, or we're a fan. I wish he was a fan, but we're a fan of his.
Maybe he is.
Maybe he is. We're a fan of his. So one of the things that Brueggemann says about the golden calves is that they were most likely symbolic of 2 major things. One is virility, this kind of power, this generative power and reproducibility. So this is about ongoing life and sustainability. The other is because these were gold. Solomon had made gold this really important wealth symbol in Israel. And so you have this kind of golden calf representing these values.
I've often wondered with this passage with the 2 calves that Jeroboam sets up, if this just began as maybe a small compromise with him intending the calves maybe to represent the God of Israel, but just in a more convenient location. But it's interesting reading the story again for the episode. It's interesting. I hadn't noticed before. He uses the exact words that Aaron did 500 years earlier when he says to the people, "Hear your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt," which I just thought was such an interesting parallel.
Yeah, I mean, and it wasn't just the calves. He appoints priests that aren't Levites. Right. He creates a new festival so he can gather people for a religious festival when the southern kingdom's having their festival. And then he makes a new capital. So Samaria will become the capital. And as we, if you think about the Samaritans, right? This is the beginning of the people that will be the Samaritans by the time we reach the New Testament. So that's all going on in the north. Now, that's why we call this the divided kingdom. We have now 2 different kingdoms. Israel is now the name of the northern kingdom, and Judah will be the name of the southern kingdom. What's interesting is they're both Yahwist in a sense, but now we're quickly seeing the north move a different direction in their faithfulness or their lack of faithfulness to Yahweh. So their fates are going to be related, but they will play out very differently. And ultimately what it comes down to, as we're going to see by the end of this episode, it comes down to how well the kings do in walking with Yahweh. So today in this episode, we're going to specifically look at these northern kings. And then next week, we have another guest next week, but we're going to talk about God sending these specific men to help turn the corner back. So that we call them prophets, right? These prophets sent to the northern kingdom to warn them about their behavior. So we're going to look at that next week. And then the week after that, we'll get to Judah's kings, and then we'll look at Judah's prophets and see how all that plays out in the south. But today we begin with Jeroboam, the first king of the northern tribes. Now, we've already seen him set up false idols to worship. We've already seen him appoint illegitimate priests and create a rogue religious festival. So right away, a man of God is sent to him to intercede. And Jeroboam is standing by this altar that he's created, offering incense. And this man of God confronts him about his behavior. Hannah, can you read 1 Kings 13:2?
Yeah, it says, "And he cried out against the altar by the word of Yahweh and said, O altar, altar, thus says Yahweh, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who offer incense on you. and human bones shall be burned on you. He gave a sign the same day, saying, This is the sign that Yahweh has spoken. The altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out.
I mean, isn't that intense?
Yes.
The priests are going to be burned on this altar, right?
Crazy.
So, I mean, how does Jeroboam respond? He's incensed. So he stretches out his arm and he yells, "Seize him!" This man of God. And of course, as soon as he stretches out his arm, it withers, and he can't, it says, the Bible says he can't even draw it back. So it's like this pointing arm that withers. So the king desperately asks for this man of God to intercede and pray for him to restore his arm. And of course, the man of God prays and his arm is restored. But that doesn't end the story, right? So, Hannah, we go on in 1 Kings 13:33.
Even after this event, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but made priests for the high places again from among all the people. Any who wanted to be priests, he consecrated for the high places. This matter became sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and to destroy it from the face of the earth. He didn't learn his lesson.
He did not learn his lesson. No, Dudley's emphatically saying, no, he did not learn his lesson. What happens immediately after this is, he goes, of course, he appoints all these new priests. And at this time, his son gets really sick. So they're all concerned, what's going to happen to our son? So Jeroboam tells his wife to go see the prophet Ahijah. Now, Ahijah's the one that had the new garment that tore it into 12 pieces. So he wants to go and find out from this prophet who previously gave him very good news, what would be the fate of his son. So he says to his wife, put on a disguise and go find out from Ahijah the prophet what's going to happen to our son. So as she's traveling, Yahweh speaks to Ahijah and says, hey, just so you know, Jeroboam's wife is coming disguised to see you. And so as soon as she walks in the door, Ahijah addresses her as Jeroboam's wife as she enters.
Busted.
And busted. And immediately comes out of the gate with this confrontation. And if you could read 1 Kings 14:7.
Go tell Jeroboam, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, because I exalted you from among the people, made you leader over my people Israel, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David to give it to you, yet you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart, doing only that which was right in my sight. But you have done evil above all those who are before you, and have gone and made for yourself other gods and cast images, provoking me to anger, and have thrust me behind your back. Therefore, I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam.
Yeah, he's already, you think about how difficult things ended with Solomon, but the very next generation, it says of Jeroboam, he has done evil above all those who were before him. So the judgment is going to be very intense. Yahweh goes on to describe that he will cut off every single male from Jeroboam's line. There will be no opportunity for a traditional monarchy. He will not have someone to come and replace him and inherit the throne. In fact, this judgment is so severe that Yahweh says none of them will even die and be grieved and buried in a normal grave. They will not even get a proper burial. They will die out in the open, and animals will eat their carcasses. With one exception, the son who is sick will die, and Israel will mourn for him, and he will be buried in a grave. And it says literally in verse 13 of this text, because in him there is found something pleasing to Yahweh. So this is another very intense judgment that is going to happen. And at the end of this, not only is this said about Jeroboam and his offspring and that he won't have someone to replace him on the throne, but there's a more general judgment that's made. Hannah, if you can read 1 Kings 14:15.
Yahweh will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. He will root up Israel out of this good land that he gave to their ancestors and scatter them beyond the Euphrates, because they have made their sacred poles, I'm curious what that is, provoking Yahweh to anger, he will give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned and which he caused Israel to commit.
Yeah, so already they've departed so significantly from the faith that they had inherited that Yahweh already comes on the scene and says, you're going to be uprooted, exile will happen. Now, we're going to find out this doesn't happen for 200 years, but what's set in motion right here is going to significantly move Israel the wrong direction. So Jeroboam's wife hears this whole, intense prophecy. She goes home. The moment she crosses the threshold of the door of her house, her son dies. The fallout of Jeroboam's sin does become detrimental for the next 200 years of Israel's history. So even though, and this is pretty intense too, so even though Yahweh cuts off the possibility of a descendant to Jeroboam on the throne, the sin still passes, meaning this idolatry now, the nation starts moving away from faithfulness to Yahweh, and that continues even though it's not one of Jeroboam's descendants on the throne.
Oh, it's intense. Yeah, and I have a question actually about this idea of sin passing on to the next generation, because it emerges elsewhere. I think we've seen in Exodus and Deuteronomy, there's verses that talk about the sins of the fathers will be visited on the children to the third and fourth generation. But then we also see verses like I think of Deuteronomy 24:16, where it says the parents will not die for the sins of their children, nor children for the sin of their parents. So we see in that it's not about children somehow inheriting their parents' sin or their parents' guilt, like unjustly. How I've understood the verse is, I guess, the consequences of a parent's sin will be felt by the children, and we see today even generational sins that kind of creep into families, or perhaps maybe is it also about the example is picked up from the next generation too of their parents' sin. So I wonder if either of you can comment on that, this idea of the sin of the parents being passed on and how we're to understand that.
Dudley, this ties into your research a little bit, doesn't it? Maybe you could say a few things about that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with the consequences of it. However, I mean, when you think about as a kid, you spend about 20 years with your parents. Jesus only spent 3 years with 12 guys and turned the world upside down. You spend 20 years with your parents, you watching them, seeing what they do. In our research, we found you can transmit parenting behaviors, good parenting, bad parenting, substance abuse can be transmitted, personality structure can be transmitted, violence, partner violence, relationship violence can be transmitted. There's a thing called the transmission of risk that can be attachment. There's a lot about attachment. We can transmit abuse. And even now, the hot word is trauma and mental health. Those things can be transmitted. And it's not necessarily that you're going to keep doing those or pay for the sins of your mom or dad that did those. But, you spend 20 years with people, you pick those kind of things up. I know when I do premarital counseling and I hear the girl or guy talking about behaviors of their family that are negative or whatever, I mean, we literally say, all right, we're going to drive a nail down here today, and we are not going to do that in our family. Stop it. The old Bob Newhart counseling thing, just stop it, and that takes work because you've learned it, so there is a little bit of both there, some consequences of things, but also you pick up bad habits. They say it only takes 30 days. Imagine being with somebody 20 years. I mean, you can pick up, but the good news is you can also pick up the good habits. That's how we kind of think about transmitting our faith or whatever, that our kids see us doing our faith, talking about our faith, and it rubs off on them in a good way.
Well, and the power of the story that we're immersed in right now is that the behaviors of Jeroboam are what gets passed down. So it's not as if, the next generations were guilty specifically for the sin of Jeroboam, but they picked up the same behaviors and they continued in the same behaviors. And then they are guilty for their sin because they're now doing the same things. And that, I mean, these next three verses, it's so powerful. These next three verses we're going to look at, because we get to these next kings, Nadab, Baasha, Zimri, and literally this is what the scriptures say. It says, like, of Nadab, son of Jeroboam, began to reign over Israel in the second year of King Asa of Judah. He reigned for 2 years over Israel. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, walking in the way of his ancestor and in the sin that he caused Israel to commit. Then the next king, Baasha, same thing, 1 Kings 15. He reigns over Israel for 24 years, and this is all it has to say about him. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, walking in the way of Jeroboam and in the sin that he caused Israel to commit. And then again with Zimri, 1 Kings 16, it says, because of the sins he committed, doing evil in the sight of Yahweh, walking in the way of Jeroboam for the sin that he'd committed, causing Israel to sin. So these behaviors, I mean, to Dudley's research and point, right? These behaviors pass on and pass on. Now, this is a powerful diagram we're putting up for those who watch on YouTube. And if you don't, look in the app, download this. You have to see this next picture we're going to put up, because it's a visual representation of the power of this lesson. So over the next 200 years, Israel has 20 kings. Now, on this diagram that we're going to show you, we're listing the 20 kings, the years that they're in power, and there's just a simple column that says bad or good. And that's how they're summarized, right? I mean, they're summarized in the scripture as they were a bad king or they're a good king. So in Israel, 20 kings, 200 years. Hannah, how many good kings do we have showing on the diagram here?
Oh, let me look. This is reminding me of like a Santa's naughty and nice list.
Right? Exactly.
I can't see, Dave, but I know it's a small amount.
There's none.
Oh, that's why. Trick question.
You can't see. Yeah, the diagram's too small for you.
Yeah.
There's not a single good king. Every single king is bad for 200 years. And again, they follow in the ways of their father Jeroboam. So this is the power of the story, and even the comparison that we will see with Israel and Judah, because Israel now, after 200 years, they're exiled. Assyria comes and takes them captive. Judah, as we'll find out in a few episodes, Judah actually has a few good kings interspersed in this, period, and they end up holding on for another 150 years before they're exiled in 586 to Babylon. So anyway, there's a lot here to process, but the reason we have Dr. Dudley with us is to talk about the implications. We always talk about the spirituality behind the story. The big lesson here today is passing on our behaviors, maybe passing on our faith, the impact of that. And so, Dudley, maybe we could just have you tell us a little bit about your research and what's led you to do this research, and summarize for us what you're working on.
Yeah, well, I, like you, Dave, became a grandparent, and we have been very blessed. Our boys love Jesus, and they both are very involved in their churches. We started having these grandchildren. Just found out we've got another one coming in March.
Nice.
And I thought, I've spent the last 50 years trying to get teenagers and families to follow Jesus. And we, have been blessed that our boys have done the same thing. And I thought, we want our granddaughters and whatever is coming to follow Jesus, and I got to thinking about, how in the world can you fall away from that? How does Israel And I started studying that, specifically the book of Hosea. And if you don't tell the next generation, it only takes one generation. I mean, some of the most haunting verses in the Bible is in Judges, right after Joshua makes this great speech about him and his family, and everybody says, yeah, we're all on board. And then it says, in one generation, because of not telling the great things that God has done, they didn't know it. And then you see the 13 judges and cycles of they're on, they're off, they're on, they're off, they're on, they're off. And I thought, why does this happen? Anyway, we started doing some research. So we did a grandparent study, a national grandparent study, and to find out who is telling their faith story. We decided not to use the transmission of faith or passing on the faith because it sounded like a one-time deal. I passed my faith on. Well, it's not a one-time deal. It's your legacy is every day. It's what you're doing every day. Legacy is not stuff you leave, but it's who you are and things like that. We talk about that in our new book coming out. But, and sadly, over 1,500 church people that we surveyed, only about 9% of them were verbally telling their faith story to their grandchildren.
Did you say 9, not 90? 9.
9. Yeah.
A single digit. Wow.
And
so you, just to clarify, you're surveying people and asking, are you even telling your story to your children?
Yeah. And we wanted the telling part because I feel like you got to tell your story. That's the whole deal about telling the next generation. A lot of people in the survey, they're good folks. They would say, well, I love God and love others. Okay. A bunch of people can say that. Or I go to church, that's how I show you my faith. And when we talk about measuring faith, it's a difficult thing. Hebrews says it's something we all hope for, but we can't see it. And obviously in science, you got to be able to operationalize something and say, this is what faith is, which is very difficult to do. But then you read the book of James, and I'll show you my faith by my deeds and things like that. And that's part of it. But Amanda Drury wrote a book called Saying is Believing. In her research, she talks about how important it is to say your testimony, to say it, to hear it. That teenagers need to hear people standing up and saying, this is what God has done in my life and is doing in my life, even if it was bad things happen to good people kind of stuff. But this is how I follow God, stay with God, stay with his people, stay in the word, whatever they do, they don't give up on God. Our students, our teenagers, our children need to hear that from us. And the ones that do, we're going to come back with another study and go talk to grandchildren. I do interview some grandchildren in the book and ask them how important their grandparents were for them. And guess what? Some of the most important things was when sitting and hearing them talk about their faith. I mean, a lot of them went to church with each other, whatever, but coming back to telling the story.
Wow.
I love this idea of passing on story and not just rules. I think that's why I even like the concept of the podcast, that it's stories have power. And when I think about passing on faith stories, it's all of it. It's not just the highlights. It's the valleys you walk through. It's the wilderness. It's the hard times. But God's faithfulness, I guess, throughout. I wonder, Dudley, if you're able to expand a little bit on what it looks like for a child to have faith. Or I know you mentioned the tendency we can have to use outward measurements for measuring the health of the inner world, which can be very incomplete, give an incomplete picture. And so with children, what is a healthy gauge or something to encourage for faith, or something that we can look for as a sign of faith?
And I don't know that you can measure that in the sense of, okay, here's my 4 granddaughters. Last night we did the story of Elijah and the widow, and I read that, and we have a visual Bible that they're looking at the pictures and talking about, and then they ask questions, and and they're going to believe right now because they see me believing, Vicky believing, their mom and dad believing. David and I worked on a book called Owning Faith. And at some point when they become a teenager or older, they're going to have to own that. They're going to have to say, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. They're going to have to believe that. But I'm going to do everything I can do till I die to make them see and feel Jesus in me, and watch them retell the story to each other. And we went around and prayed last night. And I'm telling you, I told Vicky, I said, we've seen it in our boys. They pass it on to their daughters. We're ready to die. We just,
Not yet.
And so if you measure faith, I mean, hearing them pray and then hear them tell the stories and talk about it. And she's almost 2. She walks around singing, Jesus Loves Me. I mean, it's just, it rips your heart out in a good way. And if I had to measure faith, I said, man, she's on it.
My sister taught her son the Shema, the hero Israel, the Lord your God is one. Very cute to hear like a 2-year-old recite that.
Yeah.
I'm sure he has no idea what it means, but he's internalizing a story, which is what I hear your granddaughter's doing too.
Over and over in the book that we just wrote that's being published, we instead of saying passing the faith on or transmitting faith, we say telling your faith story and the great things that God has done and is doing in our world. We talk about that all the time when our girls are around. Look at this. God made this for it. God did that. I mean, it's brainwashing in a good way. And that's what that's what the Shema is. When you lie down, when you get up, when you walk, you're constantly doing that.
I wonder if you have any encouragement, maybe, because as we've said, the outcome, even if you are passing your faith on to children and grandchildren, it cannot be guaranteed. I wonder if you can offer any encouragement for those whose children have decided not to share the faith that maybe the parents have tried to pass on. And I know we have verses like Proverbs 22:6. It says, train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it, which might feel simplistic in a way because some children do.
Well, I've been going around to different churches. In fact, I'm in Michigan today. I'm speaking at a church tomorrow about Hosea, and then about the grandparent book, and then about Honduras. So good things. But I was walking out of one of these presentations one day, and an old lady walked up beside me, and she said, that verse about when they're old, they'll come back? She said, my son's 69, said, he's not come back yet. When's he coming back? You know what I mean? We wrote a chapter in the book about long distance grandparenting and things like that. And there's so many ways. I had several grandparents talk to me about Zoom Bible studies they're doing with their grandkids across the country, FaceTiming them, Marco Polo. I mean, all these things you think old people don't know about, and they're using all these things to be in touch with them, And I met a lady in a church in Texas after I did this presentation, and she came up crying. She said, my son took my grandchildren and moved way away from us because didn't want to have anything to do with this God stuff or whatever, And so we started praying together once a week on chat. And a couple of weeks ago, she called me and said, hey, he's going to let she come and see my grandchildren. And so you just keep praying, you keep hoping, and let God do some of that.
What's interesting about this conversation with you, Dudley, is, and I think we'd all recognize, those of us who've been around walking with Jesus for decades, is it's living our life with our kids in a faithful way. It's walking together. Even some of my fond memories with you was taking my kids together, going to Honduras, experiencing serving together. But it's beyond that. It's taking them on the mission field. It's praying together at home. It's opening scriptures together. It really is. It's an active outward life of faithfulness that we engage our kids. What's powerful about thinking about what you said earlier about the one generation piece is we do all of this and we really pray and hope that our kids follow in our footsteps. But if we don't live this way, if we don't live our faith with our kid, the chance of them knowing Jesus dries up to zero really, really quickly.
Exactly.
Right. And that's what's so powerful, I think, about this story that we're immersed in now. What you bring up, it took one generation to lose it, but it's a lifetime to build it. And that's challenging, right? It's just challenging. So I would love to tell, do we have a title for the book that's coming out yet? Your new book?
We have 6 titles. It's at the publisher. So
okay.
Stay tuned.
Well, the good thing is by the time this podcast drops, so we record these a few months before they drop. So by the time that this drops, maybe we'll have a name and we can put it on a slide in the podcast. So you'll have to make sure to let us know, and hopefully our listeners will know that. Any last pieces of encouragement you would have from this story for our listeners about what we're exploring, the importance of this, what you've seen in your own life, your work?
I would say what you just said a minute ago. You got to keep being who you are, faithful. They're going to see that. And at some point, if you have kids that aren't believers or don't want to, whatever, that could happen or whatever. I mean, obviously, we were talking earlier about being adults and they have their thing. And, but I think you just keep like you said, you keep walking. You don't become discouraged. But I've, obviously walked beside people that have had kids that just walked away or whatever. And, and I've also told, speaking with young families that haven't been doing things like praying together and things like that. And they say, okay, we're going to start tonight. We're going to go do it tonight. And I tell them, your kids will hate you if you walk in and say, all right, now we're going to be spiritual. I said, you probably need to ask for forgiveness and say, we messed up. We haven't been doing this right. We want to try to do this. Would you guys help us try to get more into this deal so that we'll be faithful to God? I mean, a lot of different things that you might try, but I think I wrote a line in the book about sometimes you got to put your ego aside and just say, hey, I'm sorry. I messed up. We want to try again.
I would love to, Hannah, just for our last minute or two, hear from you. I know you were raised in a home with very faithful parents who served in the church, actually full time in ministry for many years, and you've grown up in that kind of environment. But what would you say were the things that really helped you to find your faith footing in your upbringing at home?
Yeah, I think this is such an important topic. As you said, I grew up with ministers for parents most of my life. And I think initially I definitely did not want to inherit a faith. I wanted it to be my own if it was going to be my own. But I do think you're so right. It's the stories that I kept coming back to. I think the story of my parents' transformation. I was told that often growing up. I think small things even. I always would come downstairs for breakfast and see my mom with her Bible open at the breakfast table. And she didn't say anything, but it was just an image that kind of is always in my mind that's what Mom does in the morning. She has her breakfast, she reads her Bible. And I kind of just internalized these small things. I think seeing my dad give up a career in medicine and becoming a minister. And I think I learned from him that God will always provide. And that was just a message I saw growing up. He was very frugal. We'd have all these coupons and things. But he was very generous. And that was a message I took, that God will always take care of you. So the different things I picked up on from them. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the stories they passed on.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And Dudley, it's an honor to have you with us today. Thank you for sharing your research. We'll encourage everyone to go pick up a copy of your book if they're interested in learning more. So it's an honor to have you. And Hannah, next week, we're going to have Dr. Renata First. She's an Old Testament scholar who's actually a specialist in Old Testament prophets. So she'll be joining us next week. We're going to talk about Elijah and Hosea that Dudley just brought up. So we'll have to tune in next week for that. So good to see you both. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Dudley.
God bless.
Thank you for joining this Thread conversation.
We're more than a podcast. Check out threadpodcast.org for more immersive content.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world.